for the second panel, Do Well by Doing Good, Making a Positive Impact in EdTech. And we've got another expert panel here. I'd like to introduce Ryan Hagedorn, the Chief Operating Officer at Edmentum. And let's hear it for Ryan. And got a cheerleading squad here, Ryan, with you. I'll let you introduce your panel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for joining us today for this session, Do Well by Doing Good, How to Make an Impact in EdTech. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists here in just one second, but a couple housekeeping items before we get going. We will have time for some live audience Q&A, both here in the room, and I know that there's a number of folks that are attending virtually, so if you do have questions throughout the panel discussion today, please put them in the chat, and we'll have some time here at the end to answer them. So, with that, I will introduce our panelists here, and we will get rolling. To my left is Andy Frost, VP of Assessment Products at Renaissance Learning. Andy has officially been working in educational technology for the last 15 years, and for the last 20 informally. That sounds shady and like some CIA stuff. His last 4 roles have been in product sales and marketing at Plato Learning, Edmentum, where Andy and I work together, ACT Inspire, Scantron, and now Renaissance, where he leads all of their assessment portfolio. He's also worked and consulted with roughly half a dozen EdTech startups in various capacities, including EdZap and Code to the Future. He's got 3 kids, oldest in college and youngest in 8th grade, and he has a lot of degrees from various esteemed institutions. Thanks for being here, Andy.
Thanks, Ryan.
Next to Andy, we have Mondo Davison. Mondo is the CEO and founder of Schoolz, a culturally rich and relevant content provider to schools and districts across the country. Also known as the Black Tech Guy, is on a mission to inspire a generation of black males to consider a life in technology/entrepreneurship as their plan A.
Hey. There
you go.
Okay.
And finally, at the end, we have Mark Jansen. Mark is principal of Knights Academy and STMA online school. Mark discovered alternative education when he was hired as a social studies teacher in South Minneapolis after graduating from the University of St. Thomas. He now has been an alternative educator for 18 years and is currently the principal of 2 schools, Knights Academy and STMA. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get this going. Mondo, you were a educator in St. Paul, I believe. Mark, you are still in traditional education, although in an alternative setting today. So this first question I'm going to ask to both of you. We'll start with Mondo and then end with Mark. So we're here talking about EdTech. I think those that work in the EdTech space believe that EdTech can only serve to amplify the art of teaching, not necessarily replace it. With that being said, I'd love to get your perspective on, how does digital products and digital programming and classroom instruction intersect in a meaningful way? Mondo?
Thanks. Great question. First, let me give some background context. So I was a teacher in St. Paul Public Schools, but I also grew up in St. Paul Public Schools. And so it was a unique experience, like being in the classroom and then growing up and be like, hey, I'm here. And a lot of the same stuff was happening. And so I give that to express, like, how important culture is, right? Like, culture is key. And so I remember growing up, I'm thinking about 3rd grade specifically, right? Like, I went outside for recess, football game, it was like Super Bowl every day, right? But then when you come back in, it's like silent reading time, right? Every good teacher is like, all right, we got to calm everybody back down. And so every day in silent reading time, I would fake read. Right, like, the kids that like turn the page and like put the book up when the teacher looks their way, right? Like, that was me. And I did that because the content in the classroom just didn't relate to me. I felt like something was wrong with me. Like, why when I read I get tired or I can't visualize the words on the text? And so I struggled. I didn't read a book cover to cover until I was 21 years old in college. Yeah, I'm here. So I figured it out. It wasn't that I couldn't read. It was just like, it didn't make sense to me. I'm like, why can't I visualize that? So I say all that to say, getting content from the community that is culturally relevant in a digital way that can be used in a classroom for teachers to facilitate around is key. And so because there are so many parameters around like education in general, like getting that content through the pipeline to say like, oh, that officially should be in the classroom is a struggle. And so how do we just create these kind of peripheral content things that teachers can leverage that meets the needs of their students? So.
Well, when I first started teaching, which was, again, about 18 years ago, phones in the classroom were an absolute no. We didn't allow phones. We didn't really allow technology. And now I think about how that's evolved over the last 18, almost 20 years, and how we almost expect and want the students to have some kind of technology in the classroom as long as they're using it at an appropriate time. I constantly have that conversation with students. But there are so many opportunities for teachers to utilize different technologies in the classroom. One thing I think about right away is Kahoot, and it's a way that students and teachers can immediately assess students at the beginning of the classroom or at the end. And it doesn't have to be another worksheet, or it doesn't have to be another, and so it's really meaningful when we can intersect the traditional classroom with some of these technologies that are available.
That's great. Andy, I want to come to you next and get your perspective on this. Obviously, you heard here a little bit from Mondo in terms of how it can be used to personalize and meet students where they're at with relevant content. Mark talked a little bit about how we can formatively assess students and see exactly where they're at. Obviously, through this pandemic, education technology has really come to the forefront of some of the conversations happening in and around education. As on the other side, as a provider, what's your perspective on what some of the lasting impacts are going to be in our new normal with education technology?
Yeah, another good question. So I think one of the words we hear and have heard and continue to hear in relation to the pandemic is this word acceleration, right? So all these changes were happening in anywhere, education, air travel, technology writ large, right? They were happening, and then the pandemic happened, and we did like 5 or 10 years of change in like 6 months or whatever. And I think that's pretty relevant to education. I think we've seen that. From my personal lens, the 15 years of formal working in EdTech started actually at Plato Learning when I moved here to Minneapolis with my family. And programs like Mark's, right? STMA Online, alternative education, like that was where the cool stuff was happening in education. It wasn't, frankly, in the mainstream classroom, right? It was online credit recovery, it was alternative ed, remediation, RTI, like these were the places where we were focusing a lot of our attention and investment 15 years ago in EdTech was, to help kids who were struggling or otherwise not succeeding in the mainstream classroom. And now, fast forward 15 years, right? I know our mutual colleague, Jamie Candy, on Monday, we're at Startup Week, did a session on capital events, right? Ryan and I both work for companies who are generating capital events at a pretty good clip. And the most recent one that Renaissance went through was Nearpod, right? Which is a great example, I think, to say, oh, Nearpod's quote unquote normal teachers, mainstream teachers, teachers who are teaching in the classroom, right? And Nearpod, like so many other digital tools, experienced this massive spike because it's, oh, how do I do this, right? I can't just get on Zoom, although that's hard enough. We actually saw that right before this started, right? That Zoom was tough, but then even once you get Zoom figured out, you've got this teaching process that doesn't necessarily work easily or translate easily online, and so you look for tools like Nearpod, and I think that's I think the biggest change, right, over the last 15 years is now it's the mainstream instructional process is changing, and that got, again, accelerated through the pandemic pretty dramatically.
Absolutely. And of course, we're biased. We believe in the power of education technology, and we like to see the proliferation of these tools being used in the classroom to meet every student where they're at, right? Not just alternative students or subsets of the student population. However, there's a other side to that coin, right? There's especially with the pandemic, has been the rise of just an abundance of tools that are being adopted. There's obviously a pretty rich funding environment right now, especially in K-12 education with stimulus funds and relief funds that are helping sort of amplify those efforts. So I want to go to Mark for this question, because as we've seen sort of, these tools become more and more prevalent in your school system, in your district, you look at some of the research was done, EdTech published, or was it EdWeek that put a report out saying that teachers are somewhat overwhelmed now with these amount of tools that they have. What have you seen sort of in the past 18 months that has, really impacted the integrations in the classroom, and how are you helping in your particular district sort of rationalize all that for your staff and teachers?
Yeah, so when I think about this question, I think about we have teachers who are resistors and we have teachers who are embracers. So we still have teachers who sort of resist wanting to learn new technology because it's just too much, and there's no judgment there. They've had a long career. They don't want to embrace new technology. But then we have the opportunities of teachers who embrace new technology, and these are the ones that I'm seeing when I'm doing like observations of teachers in classrooms, either online or in the classroom, that are making a meaningful impact when we're discussing about EdTech. An example, if I can kind of expand a little bit, I had a student who, a year and a half ago, when the state shut down, we sent all the students home. He was a senior, and he was on the border of not graduating. He rarely came to school. He had family obligations at home, and he worked. Well, with this opportunity that came about where we had students working at school from home, he got straight A's. And it was amazing because he didn't have those pressures on him to come to school on time, get there, not worry about taking care of his siblings or getting them rides to school and stuff, and then keeping a job. And so I think about how actually it was kind of a blessing for him to have this digital learning and distance learning opportunity. So I come from it from not only a staff perspective, but a student perspective, where we have a lot of students in the alternative world especially who have to work. And so this gives them that opportunity to do both.
Mark, I'm going to stay with you for a second because I want to get you to expand on that a little bit, because you talked about communities, you talked about the students, and going a little bit off script here, but I think it's a really interesting perspective, and that's, the role of the parent. Andy and I talk a lot about being parents and being, providers in the education technology space. It makes parent-teacher conferences not super fun at our schools, I can tell you that much, but, we have a unique lens, which I don't think all parents have, into what's going on inside a school system and what's being provided. But it seems like today that parents, as a result of the pandemic, are more engaged, more informed, and want to be more involved in sort of the educational process. Are you seeing that right now in your district? And are you giving that feedback back to providers in terms of how they can help engage your community more?
Right. So in the past year and a half, we've only used Edmentum for our supplemental and credit recovery. So this is a brand new thing for us where we have a comprehensive K-12 program. So far in the month or so that I've experienced with parents and a full-time online option for students, they're very engaged. And I wouldn't necessarily expect anything less if you're choosing at this point to enroll your student into a full-time online program. So especially at our K through 6 half of our program, we're seeing parents being extremely involved in daily activities with their students.
That's great, and certainly something I think anyone in the entrepreneurial startup space needs to be aware of, that the sort of audiences have splintered and shifted and need to be even more involved as we think about how we move forward here. So it is Startup Week, and a lot of folks are here to glean a lot of insightful information about how they continue to build their businesses, how they move forward. So this question is going to be for the entire panel here. I want everyone's perspective on it. I'll start with you, Andy, and we'll work our way down the line.
Mondo just raised his hand.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you, Mondo.
Oh, it's all good.
You want to add something?
Oh, it happens in the classroom back in the day. I would raise my hand. Teacher wouldn't call on me. So, no, so I was just going to piggyback that and just ask the question, how far are we willing to go with parents in a good way, right? So what I heard was, hey, parents want to contribute. Parents want to be part of the process. And so the panel before this was a mother and son, and she's helping build this young entrepreneur, right? And so there's something that she knows. There's a connection that she made around entrepreneurship that sparked interest. And so why aren't we taking that to the next level and saying let's ask that parent what she did. What are you talking about? What's happening outside this classroom that you were able to connect to that young person in a way that we can't in the classroom? And so just wanted to share that insight. Parents can not only participate, community can not only participate, they can add value at a different level that teachers can't, just because the cultural connection is different. So
I think that's great. And actually, you kind of were touching a little bit on the next question, so I'm going to stay with you then, because I think one of the things that a lot of the entrepreneurs and startups want to hear is sort of what's the perspective on the horizon of education? Where are we going next, especially around educational technology? And what do you see some of those opportunities for those types of entrepreneurs to not only identify what it was that was at spark with that kid that you just mentioned, but just more broadly in the industry? What do you see?
So before this panel started, I was reading this article about entrepreneurship and like how it can be entrapped for a lot of people. And so I think that, okay, I'll talk about the sharing economy for a second. So the sharing economy is everywhere, right? Like, hey, I need a place to stay, Airbnb. Hey, I need a ride, Uber, right? And so I go back, like, where has this happened? Where did it start in education? So like pre 30 years ago, like you had a bunch of scholars writing the encyclopedia, right? And it's like, oh, this is the most brilliant information ever from the most smartest people ever, right? And then Wikipedia came, right? Which is what? It's just the community saying, this is the information, this is the most current information. And so that completely obliterated anybody using the encyclopedia. And so if that's already happening, like when is that gonna start happening in the classroom where grandma has a story? She doesn't want to be an entrepreneur, but she has a story about growing up in, the 60s, right? And then now, like, here she is. That story is powerful. And so we literally just have to create the rails. We have to create a way for a community to contribute content to the classroom, hence why we're building Schoolz.
I can see the connection there. So, Mark, you're having these conversations day in and day out with your staff and your leadership of your district, talking about not only how we're going to make it through this, what is a still very trying time and difficult environment to operate in, but I have a suspicion that you're kind of contemplating what is forever change, right, and the new normal going forward. What are you guys talking about in your district, really?
Well, one of the things that we're talking about is that distance learning, however that looks, is not going to go away. I think over this past year and a half, students and families some of them have really liked the ability to work from home, school from home, and I don't think that's going away. And if we as a district can have forethought and realize that and make some of these digital opportunities for the students easier and more effective, that's one of the things that we're talking about.
That's great. Outside of what Mark said, probably being reassuring to you, Andy, in your line of work. What are you guys talking about in terms of some of the trends and opportunities that you see on the horizon for education moving forward?
Yeah, that's a good one. So there's lots of thoughts, so let me try and unpack them. The first one I think that connects to things that both Mondo and Mark have said is one of the trends that we saw in the pandemic that we need to change is these differential impacts in terms of access, right? Like a lot of companies, so I'm the assessment guy, I'm the assessment product guy, and so like a lot of our colleagues/competitors in assessment, lots of people turn to us for, hey, what's going on, right? What's the data? So our answer to that has been a report called How Kids Are Performing, right? Google it, renaissance.com/performing. We've done, I think, 3 versions of that now, right, through the course of the pandemic. And the latest versions are honestly heartbreaking because, whatever you want to call it, lost learning, learning gaps, unfinished learning, frankly, the kids like ours, right, white kids, suburban kids, well-resourced kids, they're catching up, closing the gaps if they were there, and economically disadvantaged students of color, the gap's getting bigger, and it's heartbreaking, and that's got to change, right? So I think that's one, and the funding I think is the big, hopefully, lever to do that, right? Not the only lever, obviously, but we hope that districts are spending those funds in ways that are going to improve the equity in public education. The other trend I think is related to Mondo's comments about cultural relevance. We, and even I personally, have spent a lot of time over the last couple of years working on better serving the needs of bilingual students. So, you don't see yourself in the book you're reading. Another version of that perhaps is, I can't read this book because I speak a different language, right? And not only do I not see myself, I don't see my language. And when I do see my language, it's sometimes treated as a disability or a liability rather than an asset, right? So building tools, and in my case, assessments that kind of put your ability to speak Spanish on an equal footing with your ability to speak English, and speaking the 2 languages being a superpower, like that's a meaningful way to change education, I think, and change the way that we think about education. And then I got some other techie thoughts, but I'll leave it with those 2.
Can I piggyback that for a second?
Absolutely.
Touched on a great point. Sorry, I get kind of eager.
Go.
Type of conversations. So, quick story. So, when I was in education, like the school that I worked at, elementary school, we were like the dumping ground in St. Paul. If you didn't work at a different school, if it wasn't working for you, you were sent to us, and we were supposed to turn you around. And it was a lot of hard work. And so educators in the building were like, kids are disruptive, they're running out of class, they're doing all this stuff. If they would just be in class and sit in their desk and learn, things would change, right? So let's say 10 years later, that school looks different. Kids are in a class, they have iPads, they have all that stuff, but the data is still the same, right? So what's the disconnect? Well, the content in the classroom is whack for people that look like me. So much so that I reflect back to, I was a B student, by the way. Like, I just knew how to do work going through school. It wasn't until I went to Florida A&M University, historically black college, where I felt like I was supposed to be there. I was excited to go to class. I just felt the energy like, wow, I was never taught this. This is real. Literally, that was the question I asked out loud. This is real. And I felt like my last 13 years of school was stolen from me because of how I felt. And so I'm going to continue to push the importance of like cultural relevance, and not just like being black, but just wherever you're at. Like, it is so important to hook a student if you talk to them in a way that they're like, that's who I am. Yes, I'm now listening.
I think that's great. Absolutely true. And I mean, that would be, I'm supposed to be moderating, not supposed to give my opinion, but I think that would be the one thing I'd say to all entrepreneurs, and it's where I spend a ton of my time and our time at Edmentum, is how much of an appreciation you can get by looking at some of the research that is, what are the impediments to even getting into academic learning, and language and culture, and how big a environment, how big a difference that can really make, and how that can send us down some really dangerous paths in terms of conclusions about where those students are at and what their abilities levels really are. So it's a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs out there thinking about tackling some really significant problems. That's a big one, which, kind of speaking there, you're already trying to do that in some ways, Mondo. And so I'm going to end on this question so that we can open it up for some Q&A from the audience. But I want to really get at the heart of why folks are attending this session to begin with. So this is really going to be, as you know, what advice do we have to future EdTech entrepreneurs who want to make that positive impact, make a meaningful difference? Mondo, how do we do well by doing good in EdTech? And as an EdTech entrepreneur, I want to start with you.
Dang, I wish I could have went second so I could drop a good bar. But it's all good. I would say that as an entrepreneur stepping into this space, I would start at another company, right? I feel like, or start in school, right? The only reason that I was able to build what I'm building with our team was because I was an educator for so many years. And so I was able to pinpoint the nuances that people outside of the classroom don't even see. And so literally there's just that context. Like, it's anywhere, right? Healthcare, law enforcement, whatever. If you're not in it, it's hard for you to build forward in a way that's actually meaningful. So like, volunteer, participate, go get a job, do whatever you can do to be deeply invested and infused into the day-to-day, and then you can solve for something.
Great. Andy, I'm going to come to you next because I want to hear from, your, maybe you can refer to your 5 years of covert operations, but you've been in organizations of scale, at least that I know of. So what is your advice to folks trying to get to that level of scale who are just starting out now?
Yeah, well, I think this is actually how Mondo and I have talked before this, right? This is how I know Mondo, is we talked about, we're a huge company. We got literally tens of billions of data points from 30 years of assessing kids. And we want to leverage all that data. We put in products, we do all kinds of stuff with it, but what we really want to do and haven't done yet, that I want to do with Mondo and others, right, is actually expose that in a way that creates a community, right? There's a commercial interest in that for us, right? Like, we're the de facto, arbiter of what we call learning progressions. Like, that's cool for us, but it also helps, Mondo and I have talked about, it's hard to learn how to align that curriculum to standards, because it can be culturally relevant, but it's also got to be aligned to standards, and you got to do that in all 50 states, and even Common Core isn't really that common, and on and on and on, right? So I think the advice would be like, go start in the big companies maybe, or once you're on your own and starting a company, come talk to us, right? Because we got stuff, like, we can help. And there's, I think, a lot of ways, untapped ways for larger companies like Renaissance, like Edmentum, right, to partner with smaller companies and find the proverbial win-win.
Absolutely. So, Mark, for those entrepreneurs, at least focused on the K-12 market, right? They're trying to help you and your students. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about when looking at this question was beyond sort of the core curriculum, or maybe within the core curriculum, we need to, I think, start having a focus on real-world skills for our students. So, yep, the War of 1812 is super important, but so is balancing a budget, and so is doing your taxes, and so is some of this real world, maybe learning how to code, or you know, just real world applications and skills that kids can take beyond school with them. The other thing I want to talk about is we need to go beyond just, again, the core curriculum and realize that, especially over this year and a half, our students have had a hard time, and there needs to be within any, I don't know, entrepreneur, ed tech, whatever, there needs to be more of a focus on chemical and mental health. Because our students, like I mentioned, they've gone through a ton. My office this year has been a revolving door of students needing to talk and crying and talking things out. And so while, you know, there needs to be a human side, I guess, for ed tech as well. So.
Well said. Well said. All right. With that, I'd like to open it up for questions that are in the room or questions that there's Laura or somebody's helping us with chat, I believe. Oh, you're right there. Hi. Thanks. Do we have any in chat? Not yet. Let's fill up that chat. How about it here in the room? Any questions for the panelists? You got to wait for the mic. I've been instructed to say that.
I have a question for Mondo. So I was just kind of checking out your business journal article and stuff and trying to get a feel for what you guys do. And you're talking about kind of sourcing content that's culturally relevant. How are you sourcing that? How are you getting people, make them aware of the opportunity to contribute content? What's that pipeline like? Are you looking for contributors? Are you flooded with contributors? And then how do you roll that through kind of the development process and publish it?
Yeah, so March of this year, we were blessed to get a Bush Innovation Grant to collaborate with 4 creatives from the community and 4 educators to figure out what does that relationship look like. Creatives can say, we can create anything. We can create a compelling story. We can do it in film. We can do it in whatever. But like, what do the teachers actually need? How do they need it scaffolded? What do they need to be informed about to be able to deliver the instruction in class? So right now we're doing a lot of R&D. Actually, next week we're gonna like reach out to 100 educators to say, hey, just go through this and tell us what we did right and what we did wrong. So any educators, hit us up, right? But the reality is once we figure out what those, I guess, best practices are, then we can open the door to the community and say, here's how you need to build this. The only other thing I would add on top of that is Minnesota specifically is prime to win across the globe. And the reason I believe that is because per capita, next to New York, Minnesota spends most on arts, right? And 70% of the state is white, but like we have these cultural destinations that are deeply rooted in different cultures. And so we have the ability to go to these different segments in the community and say, we're gonna pull out that rich content because our philanthropic community is willing to pay for it. They already are. And so it's just like, let's take some of those dollars and then just push it and focus on education, because right now is the time. Like 18 months from now, the norms that are then in the classroom are gonna be the norms for the next 30 years. And so if we don't lean into this work right now, it's gonna be too late. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions?
Can you expand on that? In 18 months, what's established now is going to be the norms going forward for the next 30 years? That was kind of a big bomb.
So I think that there are, in every industry, there are adults in the room, right? People that make the decisions. So since COVID hit, in my community, it's like, oh, we need to build tech, right? So who do they call? The black tech guy, right? And so unfortunately, the adults in the room in government have never built software. And so they're making decisions in a way that goes against the norms, which is like, if you build it that way, it's going to burn because you want 73,000 features in the first MVP, and that's never going to work. And so I share that because there are adults in the room in education that don't look like the rest of the community, but those adults are going to make the decisions. And if we don't influence, encourage, provide an alternative solution, they're just going to stamp, this is what's next. And so it's just how the world works, right? And so, like, I just say the next 18 months, it could be arbitrary, it could be the next 3 years, but just listen to the community, do something different. This is the time to do it different. Like, the world blew up with COVID, but now that we're getting back into normal life post-COVID, why are we going back to the same things? It doesn't make sense. So.
And if I can jump on that, right, it's similar to what happened and I don't pretend to know everything about Hurricane Katrina, right, but I do know that New Orleans schools looked a lot different after Katrina than they did before. And I also know, after 15 years in EdTech, I have never seen this much money flowing through the public education system, and I probably won't before I retire. So I think that just to underscore what Mondo's saying, like, it is a unique time in history for sure.
One in the back.
Yeah, so I somehow ended up with a fairly large circle of friends that are all in public teaching somehow. I don't know. But it's really interesting. So I try to continue to kind of get their take. They're all high school teachers as well and middle school teachers. One at Edison, actually, and that's kind of where my question is going. I don't know if everyone is aware that Edison just went fully remote after a COVID outbreak there. But, I think I'm not speaking for all teachers, but their perception is that this remote learning model was largely a failure. And really, it's not about content from their perspective. It's about getting kids to show up. They're mailing out like iPads. They're mailing out the devices that they need to actually, get online and attend the classroom. But they have parents that are at work all day, and there's no real reason for them to actually even turn on their device. So from a technology perspective, what are some ways that we can actually get the students to turn that device on and engage, in some sort of hybrid model? Like that first step in actually giving teachers an opportunity to teach.
I'll let the panel if they want to. Oh, cool. So my first question, right, would be like, hey, let's assess the situation. So people have devices. What are they doing on the devices? They're spending time watching Hulu, watching Netflix, watching Disney, right? Like, it's a content play. It is a content game, right? Every major company is investing billions upon billions upon billions of dollars into content because that's where you spend your time watching media. And so just wanted to say it is a content play, in my opinion, respectfully. And it's like, let's take a Netflix documentary, right, that's took $500,000, $5 million, whatever, to produce, and let's build curriculum around it, right? Like 13th is one of my favorite movies on there, a documentary around like the school to prison pipeline, right? Like, that was produced dope. Why aren't we using that in the classroom to engage students? Why instead are we using something from the 80s around like just this, whatever? Anyways.
That's a way better answer than I was going to give.
I'll add, though, I think that's right, but I think it's part of a broader, it's everything, I think, is the answer. And it's okay to realize that it's about student engagement at the end of the day, right? It starts with content. The students don't like the content. If it doesn't speak to them, they're not going to engage with it, right? But the other thing, too, is it's okay to say to teachers, we know that your world has changed, and we want to help you understand what your new normal looks like. And the reality is when students show up and sit down in rows in your classroom, you have one approach to an engagement model versus where you have to find them anywhere in the world, and that takes some different tactics, some different approaches, ultimately potentially using different tools. So first you got to reach them, and then when you reach them, you got to engage them, and that speaks a lot to the content, and then you got to reinforce that, right? It's an endless loop. And I think, we tried to, in my opinion, we're trying to apply dissimilar practices to a new normal in a lot of ways as well.
10 seconds, because I know we got to quick. I think teachers, right, are the facilitators of learning to facilitate around amazing content. But I think there needs to be more emphasis on the support staff, right? Let's not look at them as TAs. Let's look at them as coaches, right? Keep kids motivated, right? Tapping in and making sure that
relationships. Yeah.
Yes, it is the relationship game, essentially what you just said, right? And we have to pay them equitably too. Well, we got to pay everybody. We got to lift it up for everybody. But like the support staff is so important to everything.
And that's what we do in the alternative world, especially, is put emphasis on relationships really before teaching curriculum. And if we can get those kids and teachers with those positive relationships, I think more of them are going to want to show up to that live Google Meet because they have that positive relationship with that teacher.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think we're going to wrap this session up here.
Okay.
Unless there's just a final, Andy, do you something you really?
No, I was just going to cry about my kid's
All
sixth
right,
grade teacher,
okay,
so
all
save me, Steve.
Well, I want to.
How about giving these guys a
Yeah,
hand?
I want to thank the panel here.